Che Guevara was a theoretician and tactician of guerrilla warfare, a prominent communist figure in the Cuban Revolution, 1956–59, and a guerrilla leader in South America. After his execution by the Bolivian army, he was regarded as a martyred hero by generations of leftists worldwide, and his image became an icon of leftist radicalism and anti-imperialism. Guevara was the eldest of 5 children in a middle-class family of Spanish-Irish descent and leftist leanings. Although suffering from asthma, he excelled as an athlete and a scholar, completing his medical studies in 1953. He spent many of his holidays traveling in Latin America, and his observations of the great poverty of the masses contributed to his eventual conclusion that the only solution lay in violent revolution. He came to look upon Latin America not as a collection of separate nations but as a cultural and economic entity, the liberation of which would require an intercontinental strategy. In particular, his worldview was changed by a 9-month journey he began in December 1951, while on hiatus from medical school, with his friend Alberto Granado. That trip, which began on a motorcycle they called the Powerful, which broke down and was abandoned early in the journey, took them from Argentina through Chile, Peru, Colombia, and on to Venezuela, from which Guevara traveled alone on to Miami, returning to Argentina by plane. During the trip Guevara kept a journal that was posthumously published under his family's guidance as the Motorcycle Diaries, Notes on a Latin American Journey, 2003, and adapted to film as the Motorcycle Diaries, 2004. In 1953 Guevara went to Guatemala, where Jacobo Arbenz headed a progressive regime that was attempting to bring about a social revolution. About that time Guevara acquired his nickname, from a verbal mannerism of Argentines who punctuate their speech with the interjection Che. The overthrow of the Arbenz regime in 1954 in a coup supported by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, persuaded Guevara that the United States would always oppose progressive leftist governments. This became the cornerstone of his plans to bring about socialism by means of a worldwide revolution. It was in Guatemala that Guevara became a dedicated Marxist. He left Guatemala for Mexico, where he met the Cuban brothers Fidel and Raúl Castro, political exiles who were preparing an attempt to overthrow the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba. Guevara joined Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement, which landed a force of 81 men, including Guevara, in the Cuban province of Oriente on December 2, 1956. Immediately detected by Batista's army, they were almost wiped out. The few survivors, including the wounded Guevara, reached the Sierra Maestra, where they became the nucleus of a guerrilla army. The rebels slowly gained in strength, seizing weapons from Batista's forces and winning support and new recruits. Guevara had initially come along as the force's doctor, but he had also trained in weapons use, and he became one of Castro's most trusted aides. Indeed, the complex Guevara, though trained as a healer, also, on occasion, acted as the executioner, or ordered the execution, of suspected traitors and deserters. He recorded the 2 years spent overthrowing Batista's government in Paseos de la Guerra Revolucionaria, 1963, Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War, 1968. After Castro's victorious troops entered Havana on January 8, 1959, Guevara served for several months at La Cabana prison, where he oversaw the executions of individuals deemed to be enemies of the revolution. Guevara became a Cuban citizen, as prominent in the newly established Marxist government as he had been in the Revolutionary Army, representing Cuba on many commercial missions. He also became well known in the West for his opposition to all forms of imperialism and neocolonialism and for his attacks on U.S. foreign policy. He served as chief of the Industrial Department of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform, president of the National Bank of Cuba, famously demonstrating his disdain for capitalism by signing currency simply Che, and Minister of Industry. During the early 1960s, he defined Cuba's policies and his own views in many speeches and writings, notably El Socialismo y el Hombre en Cuba, 1965, Man and Socialism in Cuba, 1967, an examination of Cuba's new brand of communism and a highly influential manual, La Guerra de Guerrillas, 1960, Guerrilla Warfare, 1961. The last book included Guevara's delineation of his FOCO theory, Focismo, a doctrine of revolution in Latin America drawn from the experience of the Cuban Revolution and predicated on three main tenets: 1. Guerrilla forces are capable of defeating the army. 2. All the conditions for making a revolution do not have to be in place to begin a revolution, because the rebellion itself can bring them about. And 3. The countryside of underdeveloped Latin America is suited for armed combat. Guevara expounded a vision of a new socialist citizen who would work for the good of society rather than for personal profit, a notion he embodied through his own hard work. Often he slept in his office, and, in support of the volunteer labor program he had organized, he spent his day off working in a sugarcane field. He grew increasingly disheartened, however, as Cuba became a client state of the Soviet Union, and he felt betrayed by the Soviets when they removed their missiles from the island without consulting the Cuban leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Guevara began looking to the People's Republic of China and its leader Mao Zedong for support and as an example. In December 1964, Guevara traveled to New York City, where he condemned U.S. intervention in Cuban affairs and incursions into Cuban airspace in an address to the United Nations General Assembly. Back in Cuba, increasingly disillusioned with the direction of the Cuban social experiment and its reliance on the Soviets, Guevara began focusing his attention on fostering revolution elsewhere. After April 1965, he dropped out of public life. His movements and whereabouts for the next 2 years remained secret. It was later learned that he had traveled to what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo with other Cuban guerrilla fighters in what proved to be a futile attempt to help the Patrice Lumumba Battalion, which was fighting a civil war there. During that period, Guevara resigned his ministerial position in the Cuban government and renounced his Cuban citizenship. After the failure of his efforts in the Congo, he fled first to Tanzania and then to a safe house in a village near Prague. In the autumn of 1966, Guevara went to Bolivia, incognito, beardless and bald, to create and lead a guerrilla group in the region of Santa Cruz. After some initial combat successes, Guevara and his guerrilla band found themselves constantly on the run from the Bolivian army. On October 8, 1967, the group was almost annihilated by a special detachment of the Bolivian army aided by CIA advisors. Guevara, who was wounded in the attack, was captured and shot. Before his body disappeared to be secretly buried, his hands were cut off. They were preserved in formaldehyde so that his fingerprints could be used to confirm his identity. In 1995, one of Guevara's biographers, John Lee Anderson, announced that he had learned that Guevara and several of his comrades had been buried in a mass grave near the town of Valle Grande in central Bolivia. In 1997, a skeleton that was believed to be that of the revolutionary and the remains of his 6 comrades were disinterred and transported to Cuba to be interred in a massive memorial and monument in Santa Clara on the 30th anniversary of Guevara's death. On the 80th anniversary of his birth, another memorial to Guevara, a statue, was dedicated in his hometown, Rosario, Argentina, in 2008. After decades of acrimonious debate among its citizens over his legacy. In 2007, a French and a Spanish journalist made a case that the body brought to Cuba was not actually Guevara's. The Cuban government refuted the claim, citing scientific evidence from 1997, including dental structure, that, it said, proved that the remains were those of Guevara. Guevara would live on as a powerful symbol, bigger in some ways in death than in life. He was almost always referenced simply as Che, like Elvis Presley, so popular an icon that his first name alone was identifier enough. Many on the political right condemned him as brutal, cruel, murderous, and all too willing to employ violence to reach revolutionary ends. On the other hand, Guevara's romanticized image as a revolutionary loomed especially large for the generation of young leftist radicals in Western Europe and North America in the turbulent 1960s. Almost from the time of Guevara's death, his whiskered face adorned T-shirts and posters. Framed by a red star-studded beret and long hair, his face frozen in a resolute expression. The iconic image was derived from a photo taken by Cuban photographer Alberto Corta on March 5, 1960, at a ceremony for those killed when a ship that had brought arms to Havana exploded. At first the image of Che was worn as a statement of rebellion, then as the epitome of radical chic, and, with the passage of time, as a kind of abstract logo whose original significance may even have been lost on its wearer, though for some he remains an enduring inspiration for revolutionary action. Escobedo Che Guevara de la Serna, the controversial Marxist revolutionary and guerrilla leader, was a central figure in the Cuban Revolution, serving as second in command to Fidel Castro. Influenced by his travels as a young man across Latin America where he witnessed poverty and injustices, Guevara developed a political ideology rooted in communism, anti-capitalism, and anti-imperialism. He believed armed revolution was the answer to overthrowing repressive regimes, and, following his execution in 1967, became a 20th-century icon seen by some as a revolutionary rebel and by others as a ruthless tyrant. Following the conflict, Guevara fled to Mexico City where he married Hilda Gadot, and, in 1955, met rebel leaders Fidel and Raúl Castro, who were planning their own armed revolution to overthrow the government of Cuba's dictator Fulgencio Batista. Guevara said his first discussion with Castro centered on world politics. According to Campanero, The Life and Death of Che Guevara, by Jorge G. Castaneda. After a few hours by dawn I had already embarked on the future expedition, Guevara said. Actually, after the experience I had had walking through all Latin America and the finishing touch in Guatemala, it wasn't hard to talk me into joining any revolution against a tyrant, but Fidel impressed me as an extraordinary man. I shared in his optimism. There was a lot to do, to fight for, to plan. We had to stop crying and start fighting. The dynamic between Castro and Guevara was intense. One was impulsive, the other thoughtful, one emotional and optimistic, the other cold and skeptical, Castaneda writes. One was attached only to Cuba, the other, linked to a framework of social and economic concepts. Without Escobedo Guevara, Fidel Castro might never have become a communist. Without Fidel Castro, Escobedo Guevara might never have been more than a Marxist theoretician, an idealistic intellectual. Guevara, as part of Castro's July 26 movement, was one of a small group, which included the Castro brothers, who survived a first failed 1956 attack upon Batista's army, and his bravery and leadership led Castro to make him his comandante. On January 1, 1959, the rebels overthrew the government and seized control of Cuba. Guevara became a Cuban citizen, divorced his first wife and married Aleta March, a Cuban. And with Castro in command, Guevara served as executioner at the La Cabana prison, overseeing the death orders of 500 men considered spies or deserters by some estimates. He was also named president of the National Bank of Cuba, and later head of the Ministry of Industry, which included global travel as an ambassador for Cuba. However, his push for Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union, which was broken following the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, led to trade sanctions from the United States, a faltering economy and conflict with his fellow leaders. By 1965, Castro announced that Guevara had written the leader a farewell letter, ceding his citizenship and leaving Cuba to fight imperialism in other developing nations. Guevara headed for the African Congo in 1965, to support and train Laurent Desire Kabila-led Congo rebels. The liberation attempt failed miserably, and Guevara soon returned in secret to Cuba, before being advised by Castro to travel to Bolivia, where he joined guerrilla rebels in an effort to overthrow René Barrientos. A lack of local support, the arrival of the CIA and a manhunt led by American-trained Bolivian Rangers, would bring a swift end to the mission. On October 8, 1967, the Bolivian Rangers captured Guevara, and, on October 9, he was executed in La Higuera on the order of the military's high command. According to the New York Times, a CIA officer was present for Che's execution, although the operative later said the CIA wanted him alive. Photos of Guevara's slain body were made public and his hands were severed and delivered to Cuba to prove his death. However, the site of Guevara's burial was kept secret until 1997, when his remains were identified and returned to Cuba. He was reburied in a mausoleum in Santa Clara. Guevara serves as one of the 20th century's most controversial icons. Romanticized as a martyr and hero by many, his face continues to appear on Cuban currency, and his life has been the subject of movies, books, and documentaries. His own work, Guerrilla Warfare, was published in 1960, while his The Motorcycle Diaries, The African Dream and The Bolivian Diary, were published after his death. A now famous image of Guevara wearing a starred beret has become an iconic symbol of rebellion, plastered on t-shirts, posters, and more. But others consider him a communist promoting, ruthless tyrant guilty of human rights violations who rightfully earned the nickname the Butcher of La Cabin. 50 years after Guevara's death, Castandida wrote in the New York Times that, paradoxically, the rebel had become a symbol of historical changes that he did not identify with, that he did not fight for and that only came of age after his death. He is remembered far more for the momentous events that took place less than a year after he perished, when in 1968 hundreds of thousands of young people took to the streets in dozens of capitals and universities across the globe and changed the way they, their children and today their grandchildren live. Thank you for watching this video.